Hi there, Alex here at mixinglessons.com. In this video, we're going to have a look at the process of using mix bus compression. So what that refers to is the process of adding a compressor to the master fader or the mix bus in your session and having everything that's going on in the session pass through a compressor at the end. So in this video, we'll have a look at how to apply mix bus compression and some of the things that you might want to keep in mind if you're going to use it. Because you've found this channel, you're probably somebody who's interested in making better recordings and mixes in their home studio. So head over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads and get a copy of my free cue cheat sheet, my free compression cheat sheet, and my free vocal recording guide. I think you'll find all three really useful. So as I mentioned, you're adding a compressor to the mix bus or the master fader, and everything in your session, everything in your mix, all the tracks are going to pass through this compressor at the end. And so we've got a compressor here on our master fader. And so the drums, bass, guitar, they're all going to pass through this final compressor. So you'll have applied all of your compression to your individual instruments in the way that you normally would when you mix. This isn't a substitute for the compression that you would apply to the kick drum, the snare, bass guitar, the acoustic guitar, the vocals, whatever you've got going on in your mix. You apply all of that and you do the mix in the way that you normally would, but then you're processing everything, the entire mix, through a compressor at the end. And so generally the reason that we do this when we're mixing is because it's an opportunity to add what most people would refer to as glue to their mixes. So what will happen is your compressor will turn down the very loudest parts of the mix, bring those down a little bit closer to the quieter parts of the mix, and it just brings things together slightly and it creates a slightly more unified sound. But obviously the risk with compression is that it can take all of the dynamic range out of things if you use too much. If you overcompress, things can start to sound dull, they can start to sound quite lifeless. So we've got to be a little bit careful. So I've got this compressor set up here. Everything that's going on in the mix is going to pass through this compressor. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like. And what I'll do is I will bypass the compressor, turn the compressor on and off so that you can kind of hear the difference between a mix that isn't being compressed on the mix bus and then what happens when we bring the mix bus compression in. And so as you can hear there, with the compression, things sound a little bit more unified, a little bit more glued together. Now, it's pretty subtle, and that's kind of a key thing with mix bus compression. You're not really looking to make this huge drastic change to your mix. Hopefully your mix is exactly the way you want your mix to be, and so you're maybe just looking to change the character of the mix a little bit. So let's have a look at some of the settings that I'm using here. So with mix bus compression, I like to use a ratio of usually either 2:1 or 3:1. As I say, this is subtle, so I'm not looking to use a really high ratio to apply tons of compression. Sometimes I might even go down to 1.5:1. So I think 2:1 is a great starting point. That's where I started with this, and then I ended up coming up to 3:1 because I just needed a little bit more compression. But a lower ratio is a great starting point. In terms of where you set your threshold, I'm generally looking for about 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction, at least to begin with, to get a measure of how that's affecting the mix. I'm not saying you can't add more than that. I'm sure that there are people who use more compression than that on their mix bus. But as I say, as a starting point, we're trying to avoid really draining the life out of our mix or making things sound dull or lifeless. So setting the threshold to a point where you're getting a couple of decibels of gain reduction to begin with, and then applying more if you need to, is a great starting point. Now with mix bus compression, I like to use a slower attack time. Now the reason for that is what your attack time is controlling is how quickly or gradually the compressor will turn the signal down. And with a faster attack time, you lose some of the initial impact, you lose that initial transient because the compressor turns it down really, really quickly. Whereas with a slower attack time, some of that initial transient, some of that initial impact can pass through with less compression applied to it because the compressor's turning things down a little bit more gradually. What that means is that our mix retains a little bit more punch, a little bit more impact. Whereas if we were to use a faster attack time, we could lose a lot of that impact. Now, having said that, you might like that sound. There is a lot of music that's produced with a sort of fast attack time kind of sound, where a lot of that impact is compressed and you get a kind of smoother sort of sound. And if that's the sound you're going for, then that's absolutely fine. You can do that. I would maybe just recommend starting slightly slower and then moving over to the faster side. And then that helps you to sort of find a nice balance or a nice point to set your attack time at without overdoing it. But personally for me, I generally prefer a slower attack time. Now with your release time, I like that on the faster side. I don't want the compression to linger or to hang around. I want the compressor to reset quite quickly so that it's ready to turn down the next part of the signal that comes along that needs compressing. That said, if it's too fast, sometimes you can get some low-end distortion, so you can't necessarily just set it to the fastest setting, but generally I prefer it on the faster side. If your compressor has a knee setting, I always leave that on the hard knee setting when I'm using mix bus compression, and I will use the gain to just boost the level of the signal back up to compensate for some of the parts of the signal being turned down. So that's generally my starting point for mix bus compression. Usually a ratio of 2:1. I set the threshold so that I'm getting a couple of decibels of gain reduction. I like a slow attack time and a fast release time. And I find this is a really good starting point. You get that kind of subtle mix bus compression where you're not overdoing it, you're not draining the life out of your mix. You're hopefully retaining the punch or the energy that's in your mix, and then you can tailor your compression from there. Now, there's a little bit of debate between producers on when you should apply mix bus compression. Some people will apply the mix bus compression at the end once they've done all of the mixing. They use it as a kind of an additional stage or a final stage of processing the whole mix through mix bus compression. Other people will add this compressor quite early on in the mixing process and they'll mix through the compressor. Now, I can kind of see the advantages and the disadvantages of both of these methods. If you're going to be adding mix bus compression, then you could argue, well, why not add that compressor early on, and then everything that you do in your mix is kind of being tailored to that compression, because that compressor is going to be there. That's going to be the way that people hear your mix once you've finished mixing it and bounced it and released it. So why not have that compressor there to begin with and mix through it? Now, on the other hand, if you were to add the mix bus compression at the end, once you've done all of the mixing, to my mind, the process of mixing is building layer by layer towards this final mix. So as you go through each instrument, you'll compress it, you'll EQ it, you'll set your levels, you'll pan things. You're constantly moving closer towards this finished mix. And to my mind, adding mix bus compression at the end is really no different. You're just taking another step towards this finished mix. So I think that you can do it either way. And the fact is, there are very, very successful mix engineers who add it at the beginning. There are very, very successful mix engineers who add it at the end. So although it's one of those topics where there seems to be some very strong opinions and people say, no, you must do it this way or you must do it that way, I think both approaches are valid and it just depends what works for you. For a long time, I actually generally didn't use any mix bus compression, and then I started to use mix bus compression, but I would always add it at the end after I'd done the mixing. More recently, I've started to add it earlier on in the mixing process and mix through it. And I actually really like doing it that way as well. So I think any of those approaches are valid, and I would recommend trying it both ways and seeing what works best for you. So I hope this has been helpful. Don't forget to get that free EQ cheat sheet, that free compression cheat sheet, and that free vocal recording guide at mixinglessons.com/free-downloads. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.